So we always pray for forgiveness, as we do today. This is Forgiveness Sunday, and that is the theme of each of our readings and our prayers. And you hear, especially when you're thinking about praying, the music, the beautiful choices. Raymond, great choice for the sequence hymn. That was lovely to think about forgiveness in that context while we meditated to the music. And really deep down in Forgiveness Sunday, what are we thinking about? We're thinking primarily about the sacred nature and the essence, the essentiality of our community. We need to be together. God leads us into community. Our reading today from Genesis tells us of Joseph's brothers fears when their father died. When Joseph was the 11th of Jacob and Rachel's 12 sons, and his father's favorite because he was his son in his old age. And boy, did those brothers give him trouble. When he was a child, they left him down at the bottom of a well. Remember that? And then most recently, they sold him into slavery. He's in Egypt. But God always worked through Joseph to bring the family, the community, back together again. In the part of Genesis that we read this morning, the brothers are afraid that Joseph will bring vengeance on them. But instead, God works again through Joseph, speaking to them in kindness, reassurance, and mercy, gathering the family back in. This is God's powerful push, powerful pull to draw us all back together. We're not meant to live apart and in isolation, but we're meant to live in community. We are made fully human in community. Archbishop Desmond Tutu, the first black African bishop in South Africa. He's the Bishop of Cape Town and the primate, actually, of the Anglican Church of Southern Africa, which includes Botswana and South Africa and one other small country off to the east that I can't recall. But he popularized the African word Ubuntu to describe community and the essential nature of it. And I can't think of a single word in English that does the work that Ubuntu does. In a speech at the Morehouse Medical School in Atlanta many years ago, Archbishop Desmond Tutu described Ubuntu as hospitality, as an open and welcoming attitude that is willing to share, to be generous and welcoming and caring. Ubuntu is the development of that kind of character in a person who becomes a neighbor to a stranger and welcomes them as friends. Ubuntu creates the deep understanding in people that human existence is caught up in and inextricably bound in God's creation, and that a solitary human being is a contradiction in terms. Concluding his point in the speech, Archbishop Tutu said, "I need other persons to become a person myself." And that's what we see in our reading today from Paul's letter to the Romans. The Roman community of Christians was fractured and very different one from the other. There were Jews among them. There were Gentiles among them. So they're coming from different backgrounds, different faith practices, dietary practices. And so there were historical and cultural customs at issue, like what we can eat and when. So Paul's message to the Roman Christians is not that their religious and cultural differences aren't real, or that one tradition is better. What Paul tells the Roman Christians is that their relationships and their mutual support are way more important than any dietary law. That they need to value unity over any kind of unanimity. and that being in right relationship is a whole lot more important than simply being right. And that their differences, this is a good point, their very differences, the things that seem to divide them, were their holy opportunities, their assets in community, their diversified portfolio of skills and experiences and backgrounds and perspectives that would help their community to grow and thrive. Craig Coker, the Associate Dean of Chapel and the Director of Religious Life at Duke, writes, "What makes us indispensable to one another and what distinguishes Christians from the wider world is not what we eat or our ability to win a theological debate or our moral superiority or our utility, the utility of our practices, but our baptism, our unity in the gospel, which demands that we remain with one another precisely in those places where we disagree." Pastor Joanne Lee writes, "Living in community is hard. Church folks may not always agree. And we should disagree." Paul is subtly suggesting that places of friction, gracious friction, may in fact be the places that God is using to deepen our faith, to widen our understanding, to broaden our skills, and to bind us more closely together in God's body. And we need our differences to survive even if we don't have any of that gracious friction. We need differences among us because different views represent different skills, different backgrounds, different experiences that any community needs to survive and thrive. We also need differences among us because Ubuntu. We become fully human in the mix. We should pray for and hope for and work for the variety of skills among us, and even better yet, a variety of views and backgrounds and experiences. At Sunday's service last week, you, or y'all as my Georgia husband would say, commissioned our Congregational Leadership Initiative team. Deb Venancio, Dave Monroe, Valerie Martin, Vickie Hicks, and me. Your team spent the better part of this past week in the CLI Zoom workshops. We were supposed to be away at Canoga Episcopal Camp in Flat Rock, North Carolina, but obviously COVID turned it into a Zoom conference. And so we were in this workshop Tuesday through Friday, almost 7 hours every day with Zoom breaks, with a fascinating cohort of almost 50 clergy and leaders from Episcopal Church Foundation and Episcopal churches all over the United States. They were communities from New York to Texas and California to White Earth, Minnesota, and South Dakota to Rhode Island. We were very different in our location, church, community, demographics, life experiences, and in our physical facilities. But what we had in common was a deep love for our church and a commitment to our ministry. There was one church in Carlsbad, California that rented a worship space in an industrial park for $10,000 a month. And they were very concerned that that was really going to be, that $120,000 a year so impaired their ability to do mission in their community and to pursue the life of Christ, that they were trying to imagine what would be the right thing to do about that, what would help their community. Another church on the West Coast had a preschool of 95 children, much larger than ours. And so they were able to continue operations, but with a vastly reduced staff. An historically black Episcopal church in Washington, D.C. faced serious deferred maintenance issues in their building as they watched their neighborhood change around them and gentrify. They were asking themselves who would carry on their church when they were no longer there and their children didn't worship there. and the neighborhood didn't look like them anymore. So what did we learn? Well, we learned that the Episcopal Church is full of parishes like ours. About 40 to 50 people in the pews on a Sunday, a single one, or part-time priests even, and dedicated lay leaders to nurture the church community. We learned that it's time to be creative and to think outside all of our traditional boxes. All of the churches in the CLI program had rich assets, although a few or none of those assets were what we would traditionally identify as financial assets, such as a deep pledge base or a big endowment. And we learned that sometimes our assets aren't what we think they are. So what are Emmanuel's assets? Our deep connections to the community, our faith, our volunteers, our staff, our reputation in the community, which yields such goodwill, and our building and our grounds. They're all assets. And none of these are traditional financial assets, but they are great riches and great materials from which to build, with God's help, a beloved community. Ubuntu. Amen.